What if I told you that the two most heinous dictators in world history were very, very different men? Of course, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. And Adolf Hitler being the Führer and basically the creator of Nazi Germany, and Stalin being the second supreme leader of the Soviet Union. And both were ruthless dictators. But I want to talk about two very big differences between these two very dangerous men of history. And the first one is how they handled the public and their own citizens. Adolf Hitler, when he found out that Hamburg had been bombed into oblivion and 40,000 of his own citizens basically died in one day, Hitler's reaction was that they deserved to die. They didn't flee when they were told to, when the alarms went off, and because they had been lost, the war was already lost by 1944, and they deserved to die. That was Hitler's view of his own citizenry. Going to flip over to Stalin, and when the Wehrmacht was approaching and on the edge of Moscow in 1942, and chaos was starting to ensue in Moscow. And his view of his own citizens was extremely different. You see, Stalin knew that he had all the power in the world, and he was a ruthless dictator, but even dictators need some semblance of public support, which Hitler threw away in 1944, but Stalin grabbed and seized in 1942. You see, the Battle of Moscow sent government agencies running, sent thousands of people evacuating from Moscow, and they were running away, and people were honestly freaked out. They just were uncertain of what was going to happen. And Joseph Stalin was begged and pleaded by his inner circle to flee the city as the Wehrmacht approached. But Stalin did something very different. He threw a parade. Yeah, he threw a military parade in Moscow, attending, observing. He stayed in Moscow as the Germans approached the edge of the city. They could see the spires of the Kremlin from their positions about 15 miles out. But there was Stalin holding a parade in a city that was threatened for its very existence by the Germans at that moment. What did this do? Well, it did two things. It showed the Germans that he wasn't going to cower to anybody. It showed the public that he was with them. It showed the public he was with them. As opposed to Hitler in 1944 saying that his own citizenry deserved to die, Stalin stood with them, held a military parade. And sure enough, the anxiety and the chaos very quickly calmed down because they knew that their leader was there and he was going to stand for them no matter what happened. Now, luckily for them, the weather turned very, very cold at this point. I believe it was the month of February 1942. And the Germans had already outran their supply lines by this point. And so without supplies and without cold weather supplies, they practically froze in place. It was like Old Man Winter showed up and just decided to play freeze tag with the Wehrmacht. And so they froze in place, and Stalin eventually started a counteroffensive. And this, along with the result of Operation Citadel further south, sent the Germans retreating all the way back to Berlin. eventually. 3 years later, that's exactly where they ended up. And now another significant difference between the two men is how they handled their generals. Stalin, of course, historically had an infamous purge of his generals in 1938, a year before the World War would start in 1939, and 3 years before his own country would be invaded by the Germans in 1941, which is when Operation Barbarossa was launched by Hitler. Now, he had purged his generals, and Stalin saw that things were not going very well in 1941 because he had basically killed off or exiled his own military expertise. And so this is part of the reason why the Germans were able to advance so fast and get to that edge of Moscow in 1942. However, Stalin had a revelation at this point. He realized that he couldn't get rid of his own military expertise. And so he found a couple that he trusted, primarily Georgy Zhukov being the primary amongst them. And he built his generals back up from there. Eventually, by the time we got to 1942, Stalin had a military source of expertise once again. They didn't have a couple years prior. And this man would eventually come to rely on his military expertise. He did overrule them on occasion. After all, he was a dictator. But even when he did so, the generals like Zhukov would present their plans to him, and he would study them studiously, like down to every detail that he could possibly think of. And if he overruled them, then he usually had a reason. Now, going back over to Germany, we got Hitler. In 1943, Stalin captured intelligence that Hitler had been purging his generals. Of course, Erwin Rommel being one of the most famous amongst them. But Hitler, of course, had a purge of his own inner circle of generals. And he was getting rid of everybody who was telling him what he didn't want to hear. And it was that they were beat. They were already beat by 1943. Hitler didn't want to know this, so he had them all purged, executed, or in the case of Rommel, made him commit suicide. Intelligence of this got back to Stalin. It's 1943. He's in a room by himself with Georgy Zhukov. And Zhukov was like, get a load of this, gets the report, hands it to Stalin. Stalin doesn't say anything. He's just kind of scanning his eyes back and forth and reading it furiously. And Zhukov says, well, what are your observations? Stalin goes, they are where we were 2 years ago. Zhukov's like with our military leadership, and Stalin goes, yeah, exactly like that. And so Stalin had to learn how to trust his generals' military expertise, again, overruling them on occasion. After all, he was a dictator, but he learned to lean on his military generals' expertise and was prepared to explain when he was going to overrule them. Hitler, on the other hand, as you famously know by now, refused any information that was what he didn't want to hear, particularly that they were beat. And the numbers and everything else didn't matter to him because he believed that the Germans were so superior over those subhuman Russians and Slavs that the Germans would automatically win just by showing up. And he attributed anybody's counteraction as defeatism, and would have those generals oftentimes executed or at least court-martialed. So that is the short story of that. The two biggest differences in two of the most evil and ruthless dictators of all time, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. The differences were stark, and they ultimately made the difference in World War II. Stalin had the winning strategy. Hitler had the losing one, and a very delusional one at that, because he just simply believed that his people were so superior that they could automatically win just by showing up, because the Aryan race was superior. And any losses were attributed to lack of fighting spirit, quote unquote. It's because they didn't try hard enough. They didn't believe hard enough. As irony would have it, when Hitler got to the end of the war, and when the 1944 bombing of Hamburg arrived, he believed that his own citizenry had let him down, and as a result, they deserved to die. Stalin didn't believe that his citizens deserved to die. He knew that he needed their support to some extent. Hitler did not. Hitler was told by his own propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, in 1944, that the citizens of Hamburg wanted the war over. They did not believe in Hitler anymore. They didn't believe in his ultimately false promises. And they did not believe in him, and they did not support him. Hamburg citizens ultimately stopped doing the Nazi salute at all. That's how far the support for him completely vanished and disappeared. Whereas Stalin stood with his citizenry, held a military parade with them, and refused to evacuate Moscow at a time when the German Wehrmacht was almost right at the city gates. And that was one of the turning points in the war. Stalingrad, of course, being one of them, and the failure of Operation Citadel being another. I probably will speak about Operation Citadel tomorrow. But for now, this is the difference between the two most evil dictators in history, Stalin and Hitler. One believed in the citizenry, the other hated them. One believed in his generals, the other hated his. So anyhow, enjoy your Tuesday night. A little chilly up here in Minnesota. We're in the 20s. Has some good snow. My back is a little shoveled because my apartment complex decided that they weren't going to shovel the snow. So I did some shoveling on my own because that's who I am. When things are going wrong, I take charge of crap. And I'm still pushing for reimbursement on my time and energy. But anyhow, that's it for now. We'll see you tomorrow. Peace out, homies.